The lights never flickered in Hollywood. Not during its golden age. Not when the cameras rolled and the gowns glittered. Not when 1,000 eyes watched 1,000 illusions, crafted to look effortless. There was something permanent in that world. A kind of beauty lacquered in celluloid, untouched by time, fatigue, or truth. But under the soft glow lighting of a Paramount soundstage, behind the perfectly framed cheekbones and red lips that seemed painted on by angels, secrets were stored like heirlooms. They were hidden in drawers beneath scripts and scarves, woven into morning rituals, disguised behind applause, and perhaps the most personal of these secrets was hair. To the world, they were flawless. Hair that bounced like satin ribbons, curls that never lost their shape, volume like poetry in motion. But to themselves, in the mirror, under the wig stand, in the quiet before the call time, the reality was very different. Hair was currency in old Hollywood, and losing it, even strand by strand, was a kind of silent exile. For some, it started early. Illness, stress, years of peroxide treatments ordered by studios, a genetic inheritance no studio could buy off. For others, it was the toll of pretending, of being 25 at 45, of becoming the very image people fell in love with, even as their bodies betrayed them. They wore wigs, not for vanity, but for survival. And the wigs, they were masterpieces, crafted by artisans, hand-tied strand by strand, stored in velvet boxes, numbered, cataloged, transported by private assistants, maintained like priceless relics. They weren't costumes. They were lifelines. In some studio basements, there were entire walls lined with them, hundreds of synthetic halos waiting patiently for their turn in the light. They bore names like Marilyn No. 3 or The Storm, each with a role to play, a mood to convey. But who were the stars that wore them? Quietly. Who lost their hair in silence even as millions adored their image? Who stood in their dressing rooms each morning, bareheaded, staring at the face the world would never see? They were the queens of Hollywood's golden reign. And their wigs, delicate, defiant, were more than accessories. They were shields, secrets, stories left behind. This is the truth you were never shown. This is the story of the stars who wore their beauty, borrowed, brushed, and never fully their own. And it begins with a woman the world thought invincible. Her name was Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth's secret crown. Rita Hayworth didn't walk, she floated, through sound stages, premieres, and dreams. Her face was the definition of the 1940s femme fatale, luminous, sensual, magnetic. But the woman born Margarita Carmen Cancino didn't start out as the all-American bombshell with flame-colored waves cascading past her shoulders. That look, the one carved into the psyche of a generation, was manufactured, designed, and behind its power was pain. When Columbia Pictures signed her in the mid-1930s, studio head Harry Cohn saw potential, but not perfection. He saw too much ethnicity, too much of the dancer's daughter from Brooklyn with Spanish blood. Her hairline in particular was deemed too low, too strong, too foreign. So they reshaped her, literally. Electrolysis was the answer. Hours of painful treatments that raised her hairline, strand by strand, with needles and electric current. Rita endured it in silence, day after day. She was remade into someone the studios believed America would love, and America did. With every new film, she became more myth than woman. Her hair, dyed a blazing auburn red, was her signature. It curled and waved like a living thing, always perfect, always controlled. But what audiences didn't know was that the treatments, the dyes, and the unrelenting pressure were taking a toll. Even in her 20s, Rita began to lose her hair. It started slowly, a few patches along the crown, strands that didn't grow back after reshoots. Assistants were told not to mention it. Hairdressers became confidants, then gatekeepers. And the wigs, subtle at first, were introduced quietly into her wardrobe. They were nearly invisible on camera. High quality, hand-stitched to perfection, colored precisely to match her iconic shade. She had one for filming, one for public appearances, and a special one just for sleeping. They were kept in labeled hat boxes, stored in a locked cabinet in her dressing room. No one, not even her co-stars, was supposed to know. But the stress didn't relent. Her marriage to Orson Welles crumbled. The headlines became cruel. Her roles shifted, often casting her as the broken beauty, the tragic lover. And behind the scenes, her wigs grew fuller, thicker, more elaborate, covering not just a fading hairline, but a woman shrinking from the image she'd been forced to wear like armor. There was one moment, a nearly forgotten incident during the filming of Affair in Trinidad in 1952. A scene on the beach, the wind aggressive and wild. The director called for naturalism, for hair loose and blowing. Rita hesitated. Her stand-in whispered, "She doesn't like the wind." But Rita, ever the professional, went through with it. Halfway through the take, the wig shifted. Not much, just a tilt, but enough. Enough for the makeup girl to notice, enough for the cameraman to pause. The shot was scrapped. The set was cleared. Rita disappeared into her trailer for over an hour. When she emerged, the wig was perfect again. Not a word was said. No headlines followed. No one leaked it to the gossip columns. Because there was still a reverence around her, a sacredness to the illusion. But inside, Rita knew the truth. Her crown was no longer her own. In later years, friends would recall how she wore headscarves more often, how she'd touch her hairline when she was nervous, how she laughed less freely. And when Alzheimer's began its cruel erosion in her final years, taking memories, sentences, recognition, there was one gesture she clung to. She'd reach up, fingers brushing her scalp, as if searching for the thing that once made her iconic. But even then, behind faded eyes, there was something else. Dignity, because Rita Hayworth, even in secret, wore her vulnerability like a queen. Humphrey Bogart's hidden battle. To the world, Humphrey Bogart was all jaw lines and gravel-voiced grit. He didn't need to shout to command a room. He was the kind of man who lit a cigarette and the silence smoked with tension. From Casablanca to the Maltese Falcon, Bogey wasn't just a movie star. He was a new kind of American icon. Rough, masculine, unsentimental. But he was also something else. Something the cameras never saw. He was a man terrified of losing his hair. Bogart had started thinning in his early 30s, well before he became a marquee name. In the beginning, he brushed it differently. Then he tried pomades and tonics, the kind they advertised in photoplay and modern screen. But nothing slowed it. His father had gone bald by 40. The genetics were a freight train he could feel approaching. When Warner Brothers finally offered him lead roles in the late 1930s, the transformation was swift. He was no longer just a supporting gangster with a sneer. He was the man. And with that stardom came a singular, silent demand. Don't age, don't soften, don't recede. His first real wig was fitted for High Sierra in 1941. It wasn't just about hair, it was about stature, about carrying the weight of a man no one could push around. The wig added height, volume, presence. It wasn't luxurious. Bogart's image didn't call for vanity, but it made him feel complete. He took to it quickly like a soldier adjusting to armor. Each one was made of fine human hair, stitched into lace, adhered with spirit gum, and trimmed to match his original growth line. He had several, one slightly tousled for action scenes, one neater for close-ups, and one that was rarely used. saved for red carpet appearances under harsh flashbulbs. There was an entire team dedicated to it. One dresser, one stylist, and one on-call technician whose only job was to maintain and fit Bogart's hairpieces. They traveled with him, stayed in adjacent hotel rooms on location shoots. The studio never spoke of it. It was an open secret sealed by mutual benefit. But the wigs weren't perfect. In To Have and Have Not, 1944, his chemistry with Lauren Bacall sizzled on screen, but off screen, he was nervous. She was 19. He was 44, and balding beneath a carefully glued facade. One afternoon, during a break between scenes, Bacall reportedly reached up to brush something from his temple. Her fingers paused, her eyes flicked, just for a moment. She never said a word. Not then, not ever. Because by then, she loved him. Still, Bogey became increasingly meticulous. He began sleeping with a silk scarf tied tightly around his head, refused overhead shots whenever possible, insisted on low lighting and shadowy profiles. Directors knew better than to argue. In private, the wigs came off only when the door was locked. His son, Stephen, once recalled years later that he never saw his father without one. Not once. Even at home, Bogart wore a version that looked slightly tousled, as if he'd just woken up with perfect, natural hair. But the truth gnawed at him. Not because he feared looking old, but because, deep down, Bogart knew his power came from a certain illusion, and hair, for men like him, was a symbol. It was control, vitality, staying in the game. When he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer in 1956, he faced his final battle. The weight loss was rapid. The wigs no longer fit the same, and one day, knowing his time was near, he simply stopped wearing them. He sat in his garden, bald, frail, and somehow still dignified. Bacall was beside him. A neighbor waved from across the fence, stunned to see the man behind the legend, real, raw, unarmored. Bogey turned, lifted a glass, and gave the smallest of smirks. "Guess I had to let it go sometime," he said. He died not long after. And when they dressed him for the funeral, they placed his favorite wig on his head one last time. Not out of vanity, but out of reverence. It wasn't a disguise anymore. It was part of who he had been. Because even legends, it turns out, sometimes need a little help holding their heads high. Louise Brooks and the Phantom Bob. She was the face that launched 1,000 imitations. The flapper incarnate, the eternal cool. Louise Brooks didn't just wear the 1920s bob. She made it a weapon, a silent threat. A black, blunt curtain that framed her porcelain face like ink on rice paper. She never smiled the way other silent actresses did. Her smirk was a rebellion. Her stillness was louder than a scream. And yet, the very thing that made her iconic, the sleek helmet of midnight hair, was not hers for most of her life. Louise Brooks began her career in the late 1910s as a dancer. Her natural hair, thick and unruly, was more chestnut than black, with a natural wave that never stayed put. But in 1924, after a night out in Greenwich Village and a whiskey-fueled dare, she cut it into the now famous shape. A chin-length bob with razor-straight edges and micro-bangs. Instantly, the room noticed. So did the photographers, and so did G.W. Pabst, the German director who would soon cast her in Pandora's box and immortalize her image forever. That haircut made her famous, but it also made her fragile. The daily flat ironing, the oils, the pomades, the constant straightening took their toll. By the late 1920s, under the heat of stage lights and European humidity, her hair began thinning rapidly. Hair loss was not a conversation women could afford to have in that era, not even in whispers, especially not someone like Louise, whose entire brand was rooted in visual precision. So she made a bold decision. She replicated her bob, in a wig. She went to a Parisian wig maker known for designing for burlesque stars and silent actresses nearing retirement. Together, they recreated the shape exactly: the angle of the jawline, the thickness at the nape, the sharp edge that fell across her cheek like a signature. From a distance, it was indistinguishable. On camera, it was perfection. She wore it constantly. Unlike Rita Hayworth or Claudette Colbert, who rotated styles and concealed the deception, Louise embraced the artifice. She began to play with it. Some days, she exaggerated the bob's shape, making it more severe. Other days, she added subtle blue tints under certain lights. She turned the wig into a persona, almost like a mask that made her even more untouchable. But in private, she was tormented by it. Friends would later write of how she avoided mirrors, how she rarely removed the wig in front of others, how she kept her natural hair cropped beneath, a thin, patchy layer she refused to acknowledge. At night, after returning from studio events or parties, she would lock her dressing room door and sit quietly in front of her vanity, gently removing the piece, brushing it, speaking to it like an old friend. There was one haunting moment during the filming of Diary of a Lost Girl. A young wardrobe assistant accidentally knocked over a wig stand while cleaning Louise's trailer. The bob fell to the floor like a dead bird. Louise walked in, saw it, and froze. She didn't yell, didn't scream. She picked it up, sat down, and began combing it out with silent, reverent strokes. "You don't touch the armor," she finally said. "Not unless you're ready for war." After she left Hollywood, disillusioned and nearly penniless, she kept the wig in a wooden box beside her typewriter. It traveled with her through years of obscurity, temp jobs, and solitude. And when she was rediscovered in the 1970s by film scholars, invited to festivals and retrospectives, she appeared, still cloaked in her black bob, its edges still sharp. But those who looked closely could see it now: the lace seams at the temples, the softness of wear. It was no longer the illusion of youth. It was a relic, a legend, maintained by sheer force of will. Louise never denied the wig. She never confirmed it either. She simply was. And when she died in 1985, the bob, her lifelong mask, was placed with her, just as it had always been. Because for Louise Brooks, beauty was not about being real. It was about being remembered. Groucho Marx's invisible disguise. To a generation, Groucho Marx was a walking caricature. Painted-on mustache, exaggerated stoop, arched eyebrows that seemed to dance independently of his face. He was the fastest mouth in vaudeville, a walking explosion of wit in spectacles and grease paint. Audiences laughed before he even opened his mouth. But beneath the eyebrows, the laughter, and the painted mustache was a man desperately trying to conceal a slow and deeply personal vanishing act. Groucho Marx was going bald before anyone knew who he was. Even in the early vaudeville days, when he toured with his brothers in the 1910s, Groucho was acutely self-conscious about his thinning hair. It receded in quiet increments, first at the temples, then across the crown. In a world where even working-class stage comedians were expected to look youthful and vigorous under the lights, Groucho felt it slipping. At first, he relied on makeup tricks. His now iconic grease paint mustache wasn't just a gag, it was a distraction. He'd draw it on thicker when he was feeling insecure, emphasize the eyebrows, add a bit of shadow under the hairline, create a character so exaggerated, no one would notice the man beneath it. But by the time the Marx Brothers made the leap from stage to film with the Coconuts in 1929, Groucho needed more than distraction. He needed reinforcement. Enter his first hairpiece, a dense, wiry toupee stitched from thick brown human hair, designed to match the color of his makeup-darkened brows. He hated it. He joked about it often, calling it the squirrel or the helmet. But privately, he wore it with devotion. It allowed him to appear younger, sharper, more kinetic on screen. It moved when he moved, sort of. And as the Marx Brothers churned out classics like Animal Crackers and Duck Soup, the wig became part of Groucho's on-camera uniform. There was just one problem. The comedy got physical. Dancing, lunging, slipping on banana peels. Groucho's characters were frenetic, and the wigs couldn't always keep up. During a take of horse feathers, his hairpiece slipped during a football gag. The crew erupted in laughter. Groucho didn't. The scene was scrapped. He insisted on refitting the piece himself, using stronger glue. From then on, he wore an extra strong adhesive, even off-set. In public, Groucho rarely appeared without it. He once claimed he wore it to bed when traveling because you never know when you'll be recognized in a fire drill. It became a running gag. He even once removed it on You Bet Your Life, his TV quiz show, for a brief second, shocking the audience. But beneath the humor was a deep discomfort. He wrote in letters, never published during his lifetime, about the cruel trick of aging in front of cameras. How he felt like his identity was tied up in the image he'd created. Groucho, the character, was immortal, but Julius, the man, was vanishing behind the mask. In his later years, after his television fame had dimmed, Groucho began appearing more often without the toupee. His natural scalp, now fully bald and fringed in white, became part of his final evolution, but the vulnerability never fully left. During a rare appearance at the Academy Awards in 1974, when he received an honorary Oscar, he wore his full hairpiece and mustache, meticulously applied. The applause was thunderous. Yet backstage, he asked his assistant, was it convincing? He was 83, and still wondering. He died in 1977, just 3 days after Elvis Presley. When the public heard, the jokes returned. Groucho didn't want to follow anyone on stage, not even Elvis. But the truth was quieter. In the final weeks of his life, he had asked to see his old toupees. One sat beside him in a box in his bedroom. He never put it on, because by then he didn't need to. Groucho Marx had finally become the punchline he spent his whole life crafting. Honest, absurd, and deeply human. Eartha Kitt's Velvet Veil. Eartha Kitt didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She could whisper and command the room. Her purr, half lullaby, half warning, wrapped itself around every word she spoke. And when she sang, it wasn't just music, it was seduction. She prowled through songs, slinked through interviews, and mesmerized audiences with a confidence that seemed carved in obsidian. But even obsidian cracks under pressure. Behind the drama of the stage and the timeless allure was a woman who never quite felt safe in her own skin, and who, for most of her life, hid under the soft hush of wigs. Eartha's natural hair was tightly coiled, dark, and, according to the beauty standards of mid-century show business, difficult. She was told early in her career that it wasn't marketable. Agents, casting directors, and stylists, mostly white, pushed her to conform. Straighten it, lighten it, hide it. By the time she was performing in Europe in the late 1940s, she'd begun covering her hair completely. At first it was turbans, then scarves, then custom-made wigs, imported from London. She quickly found that wigs didn't just solve a beauty problem, as the studios so coldly called it. They gave her freedom, power. She could become someone new with every performance, a platinum vixen in one show, a jet-black temptress in another. But underneath it all, Eartha felt something eroding. The constant heat treatments, the chemical relaxers, and the adhesives caused permanent damage to her scalp. By the mid-1950s, when she was starring in New Faces of 1952 and singing Monotonous to packed houses, she had bald patches so large she could no longer rely on styling tricks. Wigs became her armor. Not fashion, not flair, necessity. There was one moment in 1957 on a particularly hot evening at the Copacabana in New York. Midway through a sultry performance of C'est si bon, a stage light swung low, and the glue on the edge of her lace front wig began to loosen. Eartha, ever poised, lowered her eyes, turned her head just so, and kept singing. After the show, in her dressing room, she sat alone for nearly half an hour. Not moving, just staring at her reflection. She was stunning, of course, even without the hair, but she didn't feel it. "Every night, I become who they need me to be," she later wrote in her diary. "But I do wonder if anyone will ever love who I am when the hair comes off." In public, her wigs were exquisite. She had dozens, some sculpted into elegant French chignons, others loose and wild, with volume that defied gravity. She worked closely with black hairdressers who understood both the necessity and the pain. Each wig was custom fit. Each came with a story. But Eartha never joked about her wigs, not like Groucho did. For her, it was sacred, a shield, an intimate truth she shared with no one. Lovers never saw her without one. She insisted on complete privacy when changing. Even her daughter, Kit Shapiro, admitted that she rarely saw her mother fully wigless. In the 1970s, when natural hair movements gained momentum and Afro styles became symbols of pride and resistance, Eartha quietly admired from the sidelines. She supported it, celebrated it, but never felt she could join in. By then, her scalp had been through too much. Her natural hair could no longer grow in full. There was a quiet heartbreak in that. She, who had been told for years to hide her blackness, now watched as a new generation found power in embracing it. But Eartha, the icon, could only applaud from the wings, wearing her armor of synthetic strands. Still, there was a kind of defiant grace in how she wore her wigs. Never over the top, never apologetic, just perfect, sleek, sensual, impossibly Eartha. In her final years, after battling colon cancer, she performed fewer and fewer times. But she still kept her wigs on custom stands, lined up like loyal soldiers. And when she passed in 2008, a single one, short, elegant, charcoal black, was placed in her coffin. Not because she needed it, but because Eartha Kitt never stopped performing, even when the curtain fell. Strands of illusion. They were gods and goddesses in satin gloves and tuxedos. They made us fall in love, made us believe in glamour, beauty, and the perfect illusion. But beneath the lights, behind the laughter and seduction, they all carried a truth they dared not show. A secret, a wig, a whisper of insecurity stitched into the fabric of stardom. They wore those pieces like armor, not just to fool us, but to protect themselves. Because in Golden Age Hollywood, to age was to fade, to falter was to disappear, and hair, simple, fragile hair, became the battleground between legend and mortality. Yet what they left behind was something greater. Not just the roles, not just the stories, but the courage to be almost real, beneath the greatest illusions ever captured on film. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.